The war in Ukraine is escalating quickly and entering a very impactful and potentially very dangerous stage. But most people don't seem to be aware of what's actually going on. Over 2 years since Russia's initial full-scale invasion, the conflict is still very much ongoing and is now reaching the point where it could soon pivot towards resolution, or may soon escalate further towards a broader global conflict with no end in sight, depending on the key decisions that are made over the next few months. But whatever happens, the next stage seems poised to create some of the deadliest months of the 21st century, and it all comes as each side doubles down into the plan that they hope will lead to victory, including historic decisions that the world has never seen before, not even during World War II or the Cold War. On the Russian side of the conflict, Russian leadership is becoming increasingly desperate to lock in a win, and seems to be trying to take advantage of the distraction generated by the war in the Middle East and the turbulent US election season to make major high-stakes moves, many of which are flying completely under the radar of casual onlookers, though those who follow the war know exactly what is going on. Over the past few months, Russia has signaled that they are working on something big, or at least as big of something as they're still capable of. They gutted their military leadership from the top down, and began concentrating troops for major military offensives around northern Ukraine, centered largely on the Ukrainian border regions of Kharkiv and potentially Sumy. The goal seems to be to concentrate major pushes, with the hope of capturing new territory for Russia within the next few months, with Russia conceivably hoping to push out its entire border with Ukraine as a sort of buffer zone if the war were to end. And the desperation behind this push is evident. Russia has been taking massive risks here, sustaining the highest casualty rates of the entire war, which is saying a lot. They lost nearly 40,000 troops in a single month, sometimes losing over 1,500 men in a single day, rivaling Russian losses in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, and bringing Russian casualties for the war close to 500,000, with nearly 10% of those casualties happening in just the last month alone. And this signals that, whatever they were trying to accomplish around Kharkiv, Russia wanted to accomplish it soon, and they were willing to spend plenty of young men's lives to do it. And in response to this desperate campaign, with Russia showing its hand, the West has been playing chips and placing bets of its own, with several Western nations making bold moves that they have been stubbornly unwilling to commit to for years, now suddenly all at the same time. Western weapons from several nations, including the United States, have now been greenlit to strike directly in Russian territory for the first time in history. And several Western nations have even hinted at a potential willingness to send their own soldiers into battle in Ukraine if necessary. These are massively impactful decisions that could change the tide of the battle, showing an increased international willingness to stop Russia, no matter the cost, even if it means putting boots on the ground and getting involved in a direct conflict with Russia. Needless to say, the war is heating up, and each of these Western moves crosses what Russia has previously said is a red line that will lead to nuclear war. But in each case, Russia has responded to the crossing of red lines, not by launching nukes, but by doing absolutely nothing. A spiraling effect that is leading the West to grow in confidence and take Russian threats less and less seriously, as they ramp up their interventions, with Russia ramping up its own offensives in response to try to squeeze as much juice as they can out of the conflict before Western pressure becomes too much. It's all coming to a potential head, and with the West finally making bold moves seemingly overnight, the time to double down and take even more drastic measures seems to be now or never. So which direction will the war go? Will the West double down on support and help end the conflict while they can? Or will Russia's threats continue to get the better of key Western leaders? And will the fear present in the hearts of those who are supposed to be leading us mean that this war instead gets dragged out into the next major global conflict that eventually involves us all? This is a very tense time in our world, one of the most tense times our world has ever faced. And if I'm being honest, being in the center of this and researching these things firsthand on a daily basis is hard. It can often leave me feeling down, worried, frustrated, or even sometimes mildly depressed. Sometimes I even feel like quitting YouTube altogether. But I know I can't do that right now, and you shouldn't quit on the things you care about either. That's why for this video, I thought it would be appropriate to partner with BetterHelp, who I have a paid partnership with for today's episode, and who made the research, animation, and editing for this episode possible. I know firsthand that what's gotten me through my struggles and kept me fighting the fights that I need to fight are supportive people that I can lean on whenever I need to talk through things. But I recognize that not everybody has that, or that sometimes even further help is needed, professional help, and there's no shame in that. BetterHelp is a platform that makes it easier to find a therapist online if you need one, and their mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible through remote online services. By going to their website and filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. And because finding a therapist is a little like dating, if you don't really fit with that therapist, which is a common thing with therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. According to their website, BetterHelp has over 35,000 licensed therapists, and they've helped more than 4.5 million people. So if you're like me, and the state of our world often gets you down, or if there's something else interfering with your happiness and preventing you from achieving your goals, I encourage you to give BetterHelp a try by using the link in my description, betterhelp.com/Icarus. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. Thank you again to BetterHelp for supporting this channel and the important work we do. Now, back to our video. For the first time in history, American missiles have begun striking military targets on Russian soil, something that both the United States and Russia have been working very hard to prevent since the end of World War II. But Russia's increased willingness to attack civilian targets in Ukraine, especially around Kharkiv, combined with the increasingly lackluster performance of the Russian military, has given Western governments both a reason to further intervene and the confidence to do so. The US is not alone in this. Other European countries, including the UK, France, and Germany, have also given the green light for Ukraine to use their weapons to attack targets on Russian soil, and the impact is not small. It's so major, in fact, that it may already be unraveling Russia's entire war effort, making it impossible for them to conduct further major offensives, and proving the point that many people, including myself, have been making for nearly 2 years. If Ukraine's allies actually adequately support them, Ukraine can and will defeat Russia more quickly than most people think is possible. Within hours of being given the green light, Russian supply depots and other military targets began exploding all around Belgorod as Ukrainian forces unleashed Western weapons upon them. The Russian troops remaining in the offensive descended into a sort of panic as they realized they had no positions to fall back to and no ability for further supplies to come to them either. In large gatherings of Russian troops on the border, preparing to enter Ukraine in force and thinking they were safe because of the current Western rules of engagement, were quickly broken up and scattered. The decision to use Western weapons on targets inside Russian territory, of course, did not originate in a vacuum. And far from being a Western escalation, it is actually an attempt by Western governments to de-escalate things while they still can. You see, about a month ago, Russia started their offensive on the Ukrainian region of Kharkiv, causing many doom and gloom statements to appear in Western media outlets. People, often with ulterior motives, began to predict that Ukraine was about to lose the war, and that Russia would soon capture more territory than Ukraine could hope to claim back. It was frequently implied by the media that Ukraine should be forced to surrender their territory to avoid further losses, and that Western support for the war should be completely ended. The idea was that Ukraine was so weakened that they couldn't possibly hold Russia off any longer, an idea that turned out to be about as wrong as any idea can be, as Ukraine inflicted the highest casualties of the entire conflict upon the Russian military. But in the panic, many Western governments began to think very seriously about what would need to be done if Russia began to push Ukraine back and capture further Ukrainian territory en masse. This possibility was concerning, not just because of the geopolitical implications, but because of the humanitarian ones. If Russia managed to capture Kharkiv, this would be the most significant instance since Russia's initial offensives back in 2022, where they captured Ukrainian territory still largely populated by civilians. And over the past 2 years, the world has now seen just how Russia has treated those Ukrainians living in occupied territory, a product of hindsight that wasn't available 2 years ago. Mass graves have been discovered, widespread torture has been uncovered, people have spoken of being locked in basements for months at a time, children have been stolen from their families and re-educated, and many more unspeakable things. Part of the reason Ukraine refuses to end the war while Russia still occupies territories that Ukrainians live in. And if Kharkiv was captured and the territories behind it threatened, this humanitarian crisis would grow exponentially. In the past, when faced with this choice, the response of Western nations has been insufficient, to say the least, fearing the strength of the Russian military and essentially deeming the situation to be hopeless. But this time, things were different, and the international response to the risk of a deeper Russian push into Ukraine was surprising. Several European nations, including Poland and the Baltic states, hinted at the idea that they would be willing to send in troops to intervene if things went that far. This was a dramatic shift that showed the world was now prepared for a broader conflict. And if these nations had gotten involved on the ground, chances are that other nations, including the United States, could be dragged deeper into the conflict as well if Russia attacked their home territories in retaliation and triggered Article 5 of NATO. Basically, Europe would not let Russia win under any circumstances, even if their troops had to get involved, a fact that went over the heads of most onlookers. But still, nobody wants to enter a ground war unless absolutely necessary. And that's where the decision to take the next plausible step, rather than resorting to an on-the-ground intervention, came into being, with governments finally seeing the logic they should have seen all along. Hey guys, rather than exposing our own troops to the danger of battle in the future, why don't we just give Ukraine the tools it needs to win, right now? It's not bad logic, and the main tool Ukraine needed was nothing more than simple permission to act. It turns out the main risk Ukraine was facing was a completely unnecessary one. In a word, Russia was allowed to strike Ukrainian territory with whatever weapons it desired, including against civilian targets, with no real consequences from the West other than angry news headlines and the wagging of angry fingers. While meanwhile, Western governments had forbidden Ukraine from using their weapons against military targets on Russian soil. Because, fear and politics. This meant that Ukraine was unable to concentrate masses of troops near its borders without putting them at risk of massive fire, while Russia was able to concentrate as many troops as it liked without fear. That's what created the situation in Kharkiv in the first place, as Russian troops moved from all over the country to concentrated staging areas, which were well within range of fire and could be easily seen and identified, but which Ukraine was inexplicably not allowed to strike. If the West had wanted to help prolong the war while acting like they were helping Ukraine, they could hardly have done a better job than by forbidding Ukraine from striking these targets. But this month, Western allies finally began taking their responsibility more seriously and finally removed the firing restrictions, allowing Ukraine to fire on Russian territory around the Kharkiv region. I guess the idea that you might need to put boots on the ground because you were too slow to act has a way of focusing your mind. And why risk having to replace the entire engine when you still have time to just change the oil? Ukraine wasted no time once given permission, and the move caught Russia completely by surprise. Because of their arrogance and confidence that the status quo would not change, many of the Russian supply depots and staging areas within range of the Ukrainian border were not fortified and were not properly defended. Many of them weren't even camouflaged. So once the gloves came off and Ukrainian missiles fell, and Russia found themselves unable to move in time, the entire offensive went up in flames. Overnight, several $800 million Russian air defense systems were destroyed, and the infrastructure needed for Russia to threaten Kharkiv evaporated, including strategic positions and a whole lot of ammunition. The offensive around this area is, for all intents and purposes, now likely ended, all from one simple Western decision that could have been made 2 years ago. But the impact on the Russian military goes much deeper than even this. For one, throughout this entire war, Russian troops have been able to have a certain psychological safety net while stationed on Russian soil, where the pressure went way down because Ukraine essentially was not allowed to attack them. But now, knowing they can be targeted at any time, potentially anywhere in their own country, the life of an average Russian soldier just got a lot more stressful. And this is a phenomenon that also levels the playing field for the entire conflict quite a bit more. Throughout the war, Ukraine's inability to target Russian territory has essentially meant they had a border to defend that was twice as long as the Russians, and that Russia could place support bases wherever they wanted without fear of losing them. Russia only had to defend the border of occupied territories, while Ukraine had to defend this occupied border along with their previous border with Russia to prevent further offensives, and that made the war logistically much more complicated for Ukraine. Russia clearly took advantage of this, which is why supply depots and other targets on Russian territory were not as fortified or camouflaged, because they figured they would never need to defend them, something which, in turn, allowed them to concentrate those resources elsewhere. But now, Russia will need to defend the entire front line to the same level that Ukraine has always had to, and that could push Russia's dwindling resources to the breaking point. This is extremely ironic, because a theory around Russia attacking Kharkiv was that Russia was trying to divide Ukrainian forces to make room for another offensive elsewhere. Instead, all Russia managed to do was get their offensive squashed and force themselves to divide their own resources across the entire front line for the remainder of the war, something that they might not be able to sustain. But this isn't the only thing causing the war to escalate in a way that is very bad for Russia. Within the next 1 to 2 weeks, it is highly suspected that Ukraine will finally receive their first F-16 fighter jets, allowing Ukraine to finally take the battle to the air for the first time. With F-16 fighter jets and the permission to strike Russian territory, Ukraine can target even further military infrastructure, including Russian airfields that are constantly used to bombard Ukrainian territory. They can also likely destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge leading from the Russian mainland into Crimea, along with many other strategic targets. And with Ukrainian troops finally having sufficient air cover, there's no telling what they might be able to achieve. Even without these things, Russia's offensive against Kharkiv was a failure, with them losing nearly 40,000 men in a single month. What happens next is terrifying to imagine if you're a Russian soldier, now that the gloves are off and Western weapons on Russian soil are fair game. But the big moves in the war right now still go even deeper than this. Ukraine has also been crippling stations deep within Russia that are used to allow Russia to identify incoming ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the types of missiles that could carry nuclear warheads. This is despite the fact that Ukraine does not have any ICBMs of its own. So Ukraine isn't doing this for themselves, but rather for their allies. The idea is, Ukraine is making it much more difficult for Russia to carry out any of their threats of nuclear war against their Western allies, since with the destruction of Russia's nuclear defensive infrastructure, Russia's own territory is now too vulnerable to risk nuclear retaliation. This is something that Russian state media has conveniently neglected to tell the Russian people. Not that they were likely to actually nuke anyone anyways. That was always just bluff and bluster. And for this and other reasons, Russia has responded to Western moves that they said were crossing red lines, not by unleashing the nuclear warfare that they said they would, but instead by doing and saying nothing. It seems to be becoming increasingly clear to everyone what we have been saying for a long time, that Russia's nuclear threats only exist to keep others from getting involved. The moment they actually fire a nuke, they can no longer use it as a threat anymore. Its main purpose is to nullify Western actions as much as possible. But luckily, the West can finally see through it, and are finally taking actions, and Russia is finally potentially losing the war very quickly as a result. This is why Russia's biggest war, other than the campaign on the ground, has been its propaganda war against the West, because its greatest weapon is Western apathy, built on fear and disinformation distributed by the Russian state. But despite the fact that the war on the ground is going very poorly for them, Russia does still seem to be winning the propaganda war, and that's unfortunate, because it's completely preventable if the onlooking world would simply pay attention. Despite all the things we've shared in this video, much of the world is blind to the current developments and their significance, because most people who could make a difference have stopped talking about or caring about the war entirely, or have adopted narratives that favor the Russian side, especially in the United States. Potentially the most significant campaigns of the war are just now beginning, but most people don't even remember that the war is ongoing unless they are reminded of it. Over the past few days, I personally have heard at least a dozen different versions of opinions of Donald Trump's criminal trial, from all sides of the issue, but exactly zero discussion from average American citizens about the fact that American weapons have now been greenlit to fire on Russian soil for the first time in US history. Because most Americans don't know and don't care. And I've seen an uptick in various political ads saying that the war in Ukraine doesn't concern us, at the exact moment where we now have a chance to make the biggest difference by giving Ukraine what they need to secure a victory while Russia is on its back foot. We made the mistake of not helping Ukraine quickly enough at the beginning of the war, and it's led the conflict to be dragged on much longer than was necessary. Let's not make that mistake again. Whatever they do, Western leaders need to stop implicitly playing both sides by taking inadequate actions. If they want Ukraine to win the war, they need to make sufficient moves to actually produce that outcome. If they don't want Ukraine to win, they need to stop pretending that they care and admit that they are just pandering to their voters. This is not a time for delayed decisions or for measured words. This is a time for decisive action that can save tens of millions of lives. The moves have already begun to be made. The red lines have all been crossed, and there's no backing down now. The question is, will the West tiptoe over the red lines and let Russia regroup and recuperate, as they have already done so many times? Or will they leap over the red lines and end the war once and for all? You can show your support for Ukraine by buying an I Stand With Ukraine shirt below this video. And you can support my channel by becoming a channel member on Patreon using the link in the description. Subscribe and check out these videos for more.